You might think that the sight of more children killed in relentless Israeli airstrikes would bring the warring sides together for ceasefire talks scheduled in Qatar tomorrow. But even Israeli negotiators accuse their prime minister of changing his ground rules, while Hamas say the Israelis don't want the war to end, so there's no point in turning up at all. And that leaves the world's most powerful man once again at risk of looking powerless, even as the stakes grow even higher, because Joe Biden's advisors believe Iran could attack Israel in the coming days, and the Iranians say that only a ceasefire in Gaza is enough for them to call it off.
We'll see what Iran does, and we'll see what happens if Iran attacks. But I'm not giving up.
The president is sending to the Middle East this submarine, which carries Navy SEAL commandos and fires cruise missiles. Admitting where it's going is highly unusual, but this and the US aircraft carrier, also on its way, are sending Iran a very public message not to attack. But Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has vowed to retaliate in revenge for the assassination of a Hamas leader who visited Iran 2 weeks ago. The formation of a new Iranian government may have delayed his response. Or it could be the memory of Iran's strike on Israel in April. It certainly looked frightening. Some 300 Iranian drones and missiles, but all of them were shot down and they did very little damage. So the risk is that Iran's proxy militia in Lebanon attack Israel first, which is why Mr. Biden's special envoy was in Beirut this morning, putting pressure on Hezbollah's political allies to prevent an all-out war.
We continue to believe that a diplomatic resolution is achievable because we continue to believe that no one truly wants a full-scale war between Lebanon and Israel, especially not the Lebanese people and the Israeli people.
Though listening to Israel's national security minister, you wouldn't be so sure. Yesterday, he had himself filmed singing and walking around the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, one of Islam's holiest sites. The UK's Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, called it deliberately provocative, and Mr. Ben-Gvir has no interest in talking to Hamas about peace.
We must win this war. We must win and not go to conferences in Doha or Cairo, but beat them, bring them to their knees. That's the message. We can defeat Hamas.
And this was Hamas's own propaganda video, priming the rockets it sent into Israel yesterday, though without causing casualties. The militant in charge called this blessed payback for the massacre of innocent Palestinians. Israel's response to Hamas this afternoon: more children among the victims of Israeli airstrikes. Ahead of ceasefire talks in Qatar tomorrow, where Hamas won't even be in the room. You might call it farcical, if only the reality wasn't as terrible as this.
Well, earlier I spoke to the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, and we discussed the talks which will resume tomorrow for the release of the Israeli hostages and, of course, a ceasefire. I started by asking him what needs to change for there to actually be a deal.
The Hamas will be ready to release all the hostages, and the Israeli government will be prepared to accept the end of the war. I guess these are the two basic requirements.
You've got Iran threatening retaliation against Israel. You've got Hezbollah, firing rockets into Israel firing rockets into southern Lebanon. How dangerous is this whole moment for the Middle East?
It's dangerous because it can go out of control. It's enough that there will be one missile shot by the Iranians that will hit a very strategic target, that it will, go out of control and all hell will break loose. I hope that they will be smart enough to understand that what they may say that they want to do will not bring any good, not for us and not for them.
The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has been accused by many, including by some of his own friends in America, of prolonging this war for his own political purposes. Do you think that is correct?
Yes.
And what would you say to him, if you could, to persuade him otherwise?
If someone is in this capacity as prime minister, after the terrible failure on the 7th of October 2023, with the killing and massacring and butchering and beheading thousands of Israelis in their homes, in the living rooms, in the bedrooms, after 10 months of war, is still prepared to carry on the war rather than to release all the hostages and stop this, that there is something that I can say to him that he will understand? I don't think so. Netanyahu is not the voice of real Israel. And the voice of the real Israel is the voice of people that think that Hamas had to be punished and move forward towards a possible political solution that will conclude the historical conflict between us and the Palestinians on the basis of two states.
But do you think that Israeli society, and I'm not talking about the prime minister, but Israeli society is ready for the kind of compromises that would be necessary to have some sort of lasting peace between Israel and the Palestinians?
I think it will be somewhat artificial for me to even pretend that at this time, considering everything that we have been through, particularly in October of 2023, that the majority of the Israelis share my convictions about a two-state solution as the only paradigm for eventual peace between us and the Palestinians at this point. It has to be, something must be changed. We have to move forward forcefully. I mean, those voices in Israel which share my opinion, which share my convictions, have to move forcefully towards changing the tide in the Israeli public and towards this solution. But first and foremost, the prerequisite for everything is changing the government.
The first time I interviewed you, which is about a year ago, actually, before October the 7th, you told me that, the Israeli society, the Israeli electorate had to get rid of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Then October the 7th happened. Then we spoke again. You said they've got to get rid of Netanyahu. He's prolonging this war. He's making the situation worse. Over and over again, you have said the same thing about getting rid of Netanyahu, and he's still there. He's not going anywhere.
The one thing you have to admit that I'm very consistent. I've been saying the same thing for a long time.
Consistently wrong.
Not consistently wrong, consistently perhaps unsuccessful yet of achieving the goal which I set forth, not just for myself. I'm not an interested party on a personal basis, but for the state of Israel and for the people of Israel. And I think that we are closer today to achieving this goal.
Ehud Olmert, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, Ambassador David Satterfield served as the U.S. Special Envoy for Middle East humanitarian issues until April this year. He joins me now from Houston, Texas, where he's the director of the Baker Institute at Rice University. Ambassador Satterfield, great to have you on the program. I mean, in all this discussion about geopolitics and internal Israeli politics, it is easy to forget, but one should not forget, that in Gaza people are still dying. Kids are still dying every day. And we're approaching, I think, a death toll of 40,000 now. How depressing is that for you, as someone who had to try and deal with this diplomatic, with this appalling crisis for the last 10 months?
It is appalling. And there is no way to justify the deaths of innocents, Palestinians or Israelis. What the international community has done, what it needs to continue doing, is exerting every possible effort to, as President Biden has said, bring this war to a close. That's for the sake of the Palestinians, for the sake of Israelis, for the region as a whole, and for the international community. And it is, as you have commented, interrelated to the challenge posed by Iran, by Hezbollah. It is essential that a ceasefire, the negotiations for a ceasefire, move ahead. Now, whether or not Hamas elects Yahya Sinwar to participate directly in the talks tomorrow, or to have a way to register his views and reactions to what is discussed, we will have to see. But if he is indeed concerned for the welfare of the Palestinian people, as he has proclaimed so loudly, then staying out of these talks, delaying the ability to achieve a ceasefire, is certainly not a validation of his position.
Indeed.
So what have we done? What we have done is mobilized every resource, diplomatically, in the region, multinationally, with our key partners in Europe, including the UK, to send a very clear message to all parties, and I underscore to all parties, that a ceasefire is strategically in the interests of everyone, and no one should.
I want to get onto America's role in this in a minute, but just on Israel, do you agree with Ehud Olmert that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been trying to perpetuate this war in order to keep himself in power?
I believe it is incumbent on the Israeli government to do everything in its power to see a ceasefire take place as rapidly as possible. There is no Israeli strategic interest now served by a continuation of the kind of fighting that we have seen in Gaza since the beginning of May.
But we've heard those words from you, from Antony Blinken, from President Biden over and over again, and yet Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to be changing his position and frankly doesn't seem to be listening to his most powerful ally. I remind you of the words of President Clinton after he first met Netanyahu in 1996. And it was a statement that was laced with expletives. He said, who is the bleep bleep superpower here? Who does he, Netanyahu, think he actually is? Nothing has changed.
Well, everything has changed. The reality on the ground in Gaza, the reality on the ground in Israel, socially, politically, economically, much has changed. No side is advantaged, none, by continuation of this kind of fighting.
But
a ceasefire is in everyone's interest. Now, you ask about Prime Minister Netanyahu. The role of diplomacy at the highest levels is to deal with situations that are intensely frustrating, that are difficult, not the easy ones. And we will continue to remain focused, laser-like, on this process.
After October the 7th, President Biden embraced Israel as an ally and a friend, and then added a warning. Do not commit the mistakes that we committed after 9/11. Isn't that precisely what the Israelis have been allowed to do by your government?
The president has been very clear. We support Israel. We support its right to defend itself. Nothing has changed since the president's October 18 visit to Israel in that regard. But the ceasefire now serves Israel's interests. It serves U.S. and international interests, and it serves, above all, the interests of the people of Gaza as well as the Israeli people. And we will continue to do all that we can to push forward that goal.
The Israelis, with their attack on Tehran that killed the political leader of Hamas, have pushed Tehran into a corner where they may feel obliged to react. This may happen in the next 48 hours or so if the talks in Doha fail. How dangerous is this moment, and can the Americans stop it from sliding out of control?
Well, I'll go to the second part of your question first. Look at the extraordinary efforts that we have made, both unilaterally in terms of military deployments, which are quite exceptional, as well as diplomatically in assembling a galaxy, a constellation of allies, all of whom are saying the same thing. Don't escalate this situation. Now, I don't believe for a moment that a regional conflagration is inevitable. We feel quite the opposite. It can be avoided. But in order to avoid it, in order to avoid a risk which is perhaps not intentional, but can be the result of misadventure, miscalculation, it is essential that two things happen. First, that there not be the extraordinarily risk-taking step by Iran and Hezbollah to attack Israel. And secondly, that a ceasefire move forward.
We'll wait and see if that happens in the next few days in Doha. Ambassador Satterfield.